are going to start with the very special forum that we're doing today on lessons for the resistance from Egypt, South Korea, and Puerto Rico, all places where mass, sustained, nonviolent protest movements have succeeded in ousting their tyrants. So we have a tyrant here in the US, and as many of you will probably know, Refuse Fascism has launched a series of protests on Saturdays on the theme of Out Now. We are pursuing a strategy of people power that has proven effective in South Korea, Puerto Rico, and now most recently in Lebanon. Mass sustained protests with one unifying demand: Trump and Pence out now. And just yesterday, we were in Millennium Park, we were on Michigan Avenue in New York City. This is a nationwide movement in New York City. Protesters gathered outside of the Madison Square Garden where Trump was appearing for a mixed martial arts event, and got a certain amount of press coverage chanting Trump and Pence out now. So next Saturday, we will be out there again, and we invite you all to join us. But today, we're going to dig into the strategy a little bit further. So just a couple housekeeping notes. Please, if you haven't already, turn your cell phone off or on silent. The washrooms are back out there in the lobby. And I do want to thank CAN TV for broadcasting this special event as well. Okay, so first we're going to hear from Jay Becker from the Chicago chapter of Refuse Fascism. And then we're going to hear from Mohamed Abdelfattah, who is a journalist who covered the Tahrir Square events in Egypt in 2011. We're going to be able to ask questions also. So I know there are a lot of questions, especially about the experience in Egypt. So please save your cards. If you have one, we pass them around. If you don't have one and you want one, there's some at the table in the back. And we will be collecting those and asking questions that way, as well as from the audience later. And then we will hear from Paul Street, who is a writer for Truthdig, Counterpunch, and a number of other publications, as well as a historian at DePaul University. So thanks again for coming. Let's get into it. Jay.
Yeah, thank you all for coming here. We couldn't be considering these questions at a more decisive moment. What you all do, what we do over the next few months could be determinative for the future of generations to come. For nearly 3 years, a fascist regime has ruled America. They have put concentration camps on the border. We know more than 5,400 children have been ripped from their parents' arms. This is completely unacceptable. Not one of us should be willing to accept that for one day, but it's going on right now, and the American flag is flying over those camps. These fascists have violated human rights, law, and human dignity by refusing to admit desperate asylum seekers, fleeing countries where the United States has had the major role in creating completely untenable conditions. Not a single refugee was admitted to this country in October. That is the future. And they brand these desperate people an invading army. There's a direct line from that violent rhetoric to the murderous rampages in Pittsburgh, El Paso, Dayton, and those to come. They have demonized and attacked people who are not white and fomented a violent, vicious white supremacist movement. In his speech here in Chicago just last week, Trump once again encouraged even greater police brutality and murder that targets overwhelmingly people of color. They have torn up the environment, stepped up oil drilling in the Arctic Sea, stripped away the pitiful regulations that once existed, and air quality is already measurably worse. Scientists have been muzzled, and vital work on existential threat of climate catastrophe has been put on the shelf, if not destroyed. They have even blatantly exerted political pressure on weather forecasters, and that is no joking matter. People's lives could depend on that. This fascist regime has threatened war and recklessly brandished nuclear weapons from the podium of the United Nations, threatening to incinerate North Korea. And Trump he took credit for ordering the dropping of the, quote, mother of all bombs on a tiny village in Afghanistan. That's a weapon that is more powerful than some small nuclear weapons. And just recently, he green-lighted Turkey's slaughter in northern Syria. They've tried to drive women and LGBTQ people back to the Dark Ages in the name of, quote, religious freedom. The highest court in the land has now declared it legal to discriminate against LGBTQ people if it offends your reactionary Christian, quote unquote, values. That is a new Jim Crow. That is de jure discrimination. This is also the Supreme Court, now packed with a fascist majority, that has approved a Muslim ban. A ban on people because of their country of origin and their religion. This is also the Supreme Court that in the last few months gave a green light to gerrymandering. The Supreme Court has ruled that federal courts have nothing to say about the right to vote. That's a state's matter. If that reminds you of Dixiecrats and Jim Crow, it should. That is a green light to do away with what was won in the 60s and 70s. This fascist regime makes a mockery of the very notion of truth. They are foreclosing the right to dissent, and they trample on the rule of law. They have been relentless, and they are aiming for a full clampdown. We cannot afford to deny the truth. As the call from Refuse Fascism says, the world that you have known is being torn asunder. Now, after months of stalling, impeachment hearings have finally begun about what Democrats describe as a breach in national security. This is a real constitutional crisis, and it could be a real opening to drive out the regime if we understand and act on some key things and we don't fall into the same well-worn traps. First, we should have no illusions. Trump and Pence will not give up power, and neither will the millions who support their program. These fascists have their people in the courts, and even if the courts should rule against them, they may well defy the courts. We've already seen the outlines of their response. Republican congressmen acting like stormtroopers, trying to invade closed impeachment hearings. This was not a stunt. That's programmatic for these fascists. And just today, Kellyanne Conway refused to say whether the regime would cooperate in any way with the impeachment process. Trump has called it a witch hunt and equated it to lynching. This from the white supremacist in chief who unleashes real lynching, official and unofficial. And in Mississippi a few days ago, he called impeachment an attack on democracy. In other words, an attack on him is an attack on democracy. If Trump is able to stay in office, if he survives a vote in the Senate on the terms that the Democrats are pursuing this, he will almost certainly not only take revenge, but try to make a further huge leap toward all-out fascism. Look, we know this is not just Donald Trump as one individual. He has powerful backers, a whole section of the ruling class that see in him their best and perhaps last chance to save their system of profit and privilege. And he has the 63 million people who voted for him, and within that, Christian fascists who want to enforce the Bible taken literally as the law of the land. and troops of hardcore thugs threatening and violently attacking even his mildest critics, as well as determined opponents, like the out-and-out protesters attacked with bear repellent in Los Angeles 2 weeks ago. No, all of these forces are not going to walk away from power because a majority of people in this country opposes them, which they certainly do. They are ripping up the norms of civil society and government, and central to that is the rule of law. This constitutional crisis is not going to dislodge this fascist regime on its own terms. The Democrats want to limit the inquiry to Trump's actions endangering national security in his attempt to win the 2020 election without touching on his deeper, far deeper crimes. The top Democrats are not, at this point, going after the whole range of fascist atrocities. They want to remove Trump without going after the whole regime and without calling out the fascism at its core. And that, even if it were to succeed, would leave the cancer in place to grow even more virulently. By limiting the impeachment to the Ukraine-Biden incident, Democrats are in fact legitimizing all the truly horrendous crimes of this fascist regime. Just this week, Pelosi dismissed all of them, from the denial of dreamer status to the dehumanization of trans people as election issues. When she said that, she's repeating a Trump campaign talking point. That's what she's doing. In fact, this fascist regime has trampled on the Constitution and the rule of law, the separation of powers, the separation of church and state over and over again. By choosing to ignore and in fact condone that, the Democratic Party is legitimizing the whole horror of fascism. Once again, trying to confine opposition to the most narrow terms of Democrat versus Republican, to keep us passive, looking for some savior that is not coming. Make no mistake, the impeachment investigation is red meat to these fascists. They portray themselves as the victims and their violence as, quote, defense. Meanwhile, people who really hate all of this are being told, yet again, that this next move will stop it. Like the Mueller report. What happened to that? And the 2018 blue wave elections, which have not stopped any part of Trump's fascist agenda. We are facing a situation reminiscent of that famous line from the Irish poet W.B. Yeats. The worst are full of passionate intensity, while the best lack all conviction. Yes, people who hate this nightmare have fought, even heroically, against some of the worst manifestations to protect immigrant rights, to protect women's right to abortion, and LGBTQ people's basic humanity. But there's a problem with that approach. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. All of that will be washed away as fascism consolidates power from the Supreme Court on down if we don't stop it. In fact, the only thing that can really get rid of this regime will be mass outpourings in the streets, nonviolent, week after week, growing in numbers and determination, making clear that we refuse to accept a fascist America. We demand that the Trump-Pence regime must go now. These have been done all over the world, from Algeria to Puerto Rico, Egypt to Hong Kong, as we will hear much more in depth this afternoon. And there's no reason we cannot learn from those struggles. If these protests here take root and grow, then the impeachment process can play a role. But if we sit passively waiting for that process up there by somebody else to solve the problem, we may well end up in a far worse spot than we are in today. With this vision and understanding, Refuse Fascism has launched the Out Now movement, starting in New York and Los Angeles on October 19th, and now in its second week in 14 cities and growing. This one demand, Trump Pence Out Now, states unequivocally that this is the only way capable of actually stopping a fascist regime whose program is an absolute nightmare. And we're coming back, week after week, each week advancing toward our goal. We're not simply reacting to outrages, as important as that is. We're resetting the terms of opposition to this whole regime and preparing the ground for millions who need to step out at the soonest possible time to join us. We're also finding that this image of #OutNow is a powerful visual statement that's being picked up in photos and social media, from the anti-Trump protest here in Chicago last week to the outpouring against his appearance in Madison Square Garden yesterday. This is a very clear representation of what we're going for, out now. That's our one demand, which we will not stop until it's accomplished. As Andy Z., one of the initiators of Refuse Fascism and spokesperson for Revolution Books in New York, said at the Union Square launch of the Out Now movement, this is not the easiest way, but it's the necessary way to stop a fascist regime. We are cognizant of the fact that we are undertaking something that's never been done before in history, attempting to stop fascism before it has fully consolidated in a country like the US. And there's a lot of fear bound up with that. We hear it all the time. And frankly, if you haven't thought about it, maybe you're not facing the full reality of the Trump fascist regime. There is a social base for this vicious America first, white supremacy and misogyny, with their thugs in the streets and their masters in the halls of power. But there is a way to overcome that fear by acting together on the principles that we're fighting for, humanity and the planet. Every movement for real progress in this country and anywhere in the world has had to face up to that fear, and we must do the same. Because you know what we really need to be afraid of? I don't know about you, but what keeps me and probably many of you up at night? The fear that we, all of us, who hate these concentration camps, this white supremacy and this whole fascist program, that we will not come together, that we will not do that in time, that we will not do what's necessary to stop it, that we will not act with the same intensity and commitment of the other side. For completely different values, but far outdoing their commitment. Everyone who really can't tolerate another day of this horror, who can't look at themselves in the mirror if they're not standing up to it, this is the movement that belongs to all of you and to all of us. Whether you consider yourself part of the resistance or not, whether you're working with other organizations, bring your passion to stop these outrages into the drive into this driving out this fascist regime. That's our invitation and it's our challenge. It's our challenge in two senses. A challenge to you to act on your hatred, to make that commitment every Saturday, to be out in the streets, out now, to bring more and more people into this movement. And it's a challenge to us to find the ways to do that, to grow in numbers and commitment and reach while we still can, to use the opportunity of this constitutional crisis to turn it into a real crisis that presents this regime with something it has never faced before, a committed mass people's movement. And I just want to end with the end of our call, our pledge, our commitment. The world as we have known it is being torn asunder. We must cast off fear and passivity and not allow our differences to stand in the way of rising together in the unprecedented, unrelenting, nonviolent, out now protests to drive out the Trump-Pence regime. We must seize on the impeachment crisis now erupting, take history into our own hands, and turn dread for the future into a force for hope. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank thank you, Jay, and Lena and Paul for having me, and thanks to everyone who's come today. Hopefully I'll try to share just very few remarks from my experience as an Egyptian and as an Egyptian journalist who's covered the uprising that occurred in 2011 and the aftermath, and trying to make sense of it. Probably I'll touch on a couple points, but I'll invite more of you to ask in the Q&A if you have any questions. I want to say, back to January 25th, 2011, the streets of my hometown, Alexandria, in Egypt. Back then I was a reporter and a video journalist for a local outlet, and I headed outside to see whether the protests that had been planned for 2 p.m. that day will materialize. The protests of January 25th were planned by a Facebook page set up to memorialize the brutal killing of a young man from Alexandria by the name of Khalid Saeed on the hands of the police. The demands listed back then on this Facebook event were really narrowly focused on merely the replacement of the Egyptian Minister of Interior, who runs the central police force across all of Egypt, in addition to some social demands. There was nothing back then in this initial wave of protest that really was demanding an overhaul of the regime as a whole, or challenging the president who had been in power for 30 years then, which is really interesting. But back 10 days before January 25th, 2011, the long-ruling dictator of Tunisia, Zain al-Abidin Ben Ali, was forced to resign following an uprising, also triggered by the killing on the hands of the police of a local fruit vendor on the street. All of a sudden, the calculus of our politics as Egyptians, most importantly, I would say the calculus of our emotions as Egyptians, when we saw that resignation from an Arab dictator, completely changed. We couldn't help but feel the blood rushing in our veins, and almost viscerally we headed down to the Tunisian embassy in Cairo to celebrate and truly wish that something similar could happen in Egypt. As I go around the meeting points, back to January 25th again, in Alexandria, as I go around the meeting points planned for these demonstrations, I was surprised to find tens of mostly young, unpoliticized people trickling in. Totally fresh faces that I had not seen before in any of the demonstrations or local political and social activism that had been occurring in Egypt for years before the revolution. None of those faces were present. There were people who, for the first time, were just responding to an act of police brutality, a Facebook invitation. The police violence that happened before that really broke a ceiling with the Egyptian middle class that had not been broken before. As we started marching that day, small demonstrations met each other around the city, and the numbers continued to mushroom almost exponentially. A couple of hours later, we started hearing that similar demonstrations were happening in Cairo and other major urban areas. People were cheering us on the sidewalks, and suddenly the air for us was smelling differently. We suddenly felt that this country was ours again, that we were able to affect where it's headed and probably save it from a doomed destiny. By 7 p.m. that day, that evening, the large demonstration I was in, which had grown to about tens of thousands of people back then, something my generation had not seen before, was trapped by the Central Security Forces, the riot police, in the street where the governor of Alexandria lived, and was basically decimated. What happened that day, basically a revolution. Everyone saw that a revolution has just begun. And we had no idea where it was going, which is probably a virus that plagued the revolution down the line. The main slogan we had was Aish, Hurriya, Adala Ijtimaiya, which means bread, freedom, and social justice. That was one of the main chants on the streets that was galvanizing everyone. Another major chant was Al-Sha'b yurid isqat al-nizam. The people want the fall of the regime. The people want the overthrow of the regime. These same chants right now are reverberating across the Arab world. And back then, 2011, 2012, they were also echoing across the Arab world. I want to say that the frustrations that led to the uprising in Egypt were a convoluted mix of police brutality, social inequality, and a lack of political freedoms, an absolute lack of political freedoms. Hosni Mubarak, the president back then, had been ruling Egypt since 1981. And all elections were rigged by sheer force, thugs on the streets, shutting down polling stations, preventing people from going. If you ever dared to run against Mubarak, you needed to prepare your back, your physical back, for cigarettes and torture chambers. Find a way to withstand your nails being pulled out alive. There was not a single avenue for change, not a single one. No elections, nothing was ever tolerated back then. The only way out was definitely a revolution. I would say pro-democracy in Egypt back then largely comprised of secular left-wing and some center-right groups were calling for various reforms at various paces, at various speeds. The only other force in cahoots with the government of Mubarak were the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an old, secretive, and theocratic movement that seeks to unite the entire Muslim world under a backward caliphate. The Mubarak regime always made sure to engineer the political scene in Egypt in a way that allowed only the Muslim Brotherhood to appear as the only viable option in the case of his own demise. And it's a trick that they still play to this day. They were the only force that allowed to start groups on campus and recruit students. They were the only groups that were allowed to distribute flyers, hold events, invite speakers, and engage the public. And in the few years before the revolution, they were the only group that was allowed to appear on TV. No wonder when free elections were finally held in 2011, these Islamist forces appear truly to be the only alternative. Long story short, the reason the Egyptian revolution ultimately failed was a mix of political scheming between the military, which inherited the Mubarak regime, and the Muslim Brotherhood, as well as the total naivete on the part of the secular revolutionaries, left and right, and all of that contributed to the failure of the 2011 uprising. And right now, as we can see, the emergence of a terrible authoritarian government that completely shut down politics. And Egypt right now is in a much worse shape than during Mubarak. The Egyptian uprising of 2011, as many of us know, inspired a wave of protests across the Arab world then and now. Only a couple of weeks ago, as some of us may have heard, the revolutionary spark reached Lebanon following the government's decision to impose a tax on voice calls over the internet, the so-called WhatsApp tax. This was only the straw that appears to have broken the camel's back, but you also need to know that Lebanon is a country already straddled with so much debt. I think about 150% of Lebanon's gross domestic product. That's the ratio between the GDP and the debt. Almost half of the government revenue in Lebanon is spent on interest payments. Half of the government revenue. In Chile, a fair hike set off demonstrations that are now revealing that maybe not too much has changed since the demise of Pinochet. In Iraq, a sectarian government under a huge amount of influence from Iran erupted, demanding a new secular government that serves its own people. Even yesterday, in New York, people were jumping turnstiles, protesting police brutality and social inequality. All these things are connected. All these things are connected with one common thread. Even you come here to Chicago, teachers are wondering why the newly elected progressive mayor is not honoring her promises to prioritize those in need, and instead started her mayoral career addressing the business elite and chambers of commerce. The common global thread that I want to draw everyone's attention to, running through all these stories, is a staggering gap between the haves and the have-nots across all these countries. It's also an apparent crisis in democratic governance. The democratic procedures that we're now used to worldwide are failing at an increasing rate at forming governments and building sustainable political coalitions. We've seen that several years ago in Spain. We've seen it many months ago, ironically, with a far-right government in Italy. We're seeing it recently in a deadlock in Israel, forming a government. There is something very hard about being able to govern now, and I think it's across the political spectrum, not just with progressive forces. The frustrations boiling from below around the world demand a new system of governance, a new version of democracy, perhaps, that makes sense and serves those who are vulnerable, poor, and insecure. Thank you.
Thank you, Refuse Fascism, for holding this event. Thank you for all coming out. Thank you for CAN TV for covering this. There's no real mystery about how you humble, even overthrow corrupt and tyrannical governments. Look at Ecuador, where the government recently had to flee Quito and repeal a neoliberal austerity package because of popular rebellion. Chile, last week, 1.5 million people in the streets of Santiago to protest inequality, regressive taxes, corruption, and to roll back austerity. Or Puerto Rico, last year, millions in the streets to force out a corrupt, racist, and sexist governor. The Gilets Jaunes in France, the prolonged civil disobedience in Hong Kong, the millions who came out last September to protest the capitalogenic climate catastrophe around the world. The masses who have now come out to resist corruption and inequality in Haiti, in Lebanon, and in Iraq, where protests continue in the face of live ammunition, and the president has recently offered to resign, or so I heard on the news the other day. You'd barely know it from watching the American nightly and cable news, but the world is awash in popular rebellion against tyranny, corruption, inequality, and ecocide. Power to the people. And it's effective, and it doesn't take the whole population. Roger Hallam, a leader of Extinction Rebellion, notes that dedicated resistance by just 3% of a nation's population is sufficient to bring down a regime. 5 days of insurrection by 200,000 people forced the French government to back down on a regressive fuel tax last year. United States Americans, we have our own underreported record of history-changing mass rebellion. Going back to the colonial era, Bacon's Rebellion, 1676, the Boston Tea Party, 1774, a popular action to destroy a lot of capitalist property, incidentally, which is why the Boston Brahmins never liked to highlight the Tea Party very much in the early histories of the American Revolution. The abolitionist struggle, the 8-hour movement, the women's movement, the 1936-37 sit-down strike, civil rights struggle, Black Lives Matter, Black Power, and Occupy, which spread across the nation like a wildfire cell phone map in about a week in late 2011. What will it take for U.S. Americans to reconnect with that history and join the wave of mass protests spreading around the world? We have inequality and plutocracy, problems worse than those of Europe and every bit as bad now as those of Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Ecuador, Colombia. It is widely and accurately understood by everyday Americans that majority public opinion is largely irrelevant in the making of American so-called public policy, because politicians atop both major U.S. political organizations are bought and paid for by the corporate sector. This is widely understood. There's academic studies that document this comprehensively, but it's what Joe Sixpack and Jane Q Sixpack already very well understand. The so-called land of liberty possesses a globally unmatched militarized police and surveillance state and the highest rate of incarceration, racist mass incarceration in human history. Millions of American children go without proper food, clothing, shelter, and schooling so that American government can funnel hundreds of billions of dollars each year to the Pentagon system, which functions as a great subsidy for the high-tech corporate sector. Our ruling class is accelerating the process of turning the entire planet into a giant greenhouse gas chamber, and now it has installed a wannabe fascist strongman, the malignant, racist, and sexist authoritarian Donald Trump atop the White House. What's holding us back from reigniting our own mass protest tradition to do the first and most obvious thing, which is to bring down the Trump-Pence regime? Three things, I think. Three things we have to work through and get past. Thing one, we have to get past the comforting American exceptionalist notion that fascism can't happen here in the United States of America. I'm sorry, 250 years of slavery happened here. The genocidal elimination of the continent's original inhabitants happened here. A historically unmatched empire that has slaughtered literally millions of brown-skinned people from the Philippines at the end of the 19th century to Yemen today happened and is happening. Our globally unmatched police and prison state has happened and is happening right now. And of course, Donald Make America Hate Again Trump is happening right now. And Jay Becker already went through a number of the ways in which Donald Trump is essentially and for all intents and purposes a fascist politician who just happens to be sitting in the most powerful office in the history of the human race right now as we speak. So I don't think I have to go into great depth around that. He once had asked me for my own elaborations on how and why Trump is a fascist. We can do that in the Q&A. All of this fascism, I might add, while Trump wages a constant war on truth, replete with more than 10,000 documentable false statements since his inauguration. Donald Trump is the first president, I'm a historian, that I can think of in American history to pose a serious threat of refusing to honor a re-election count that doesn't go his way. It sounds surreal and strange and hard to imagine that that's really the case, but it really is. Michael Cohen wasn't wrong about that. There are thoroughly imaginable scenarios that he himself has given clues to us about, that if he doesn't get the Electoral College outcome he wants next year, he may refuse to leave. We have to get over this denial that we have about just how bad Trump is and how really it's his fascist style of politics. And now he's basically a fascist. Second thing we have to get over, I think, is the notion that the dismal, dollar-drenched, depressing, demobilizing Democratic Party will get us out of this creeping fascist mess that we're in. It won't. We're from Chicago here, okay? A lot of people here lived through both daily mayoralties and a few other neoliberal corporate mayoralties. We're not naive about the Democratic Party in Chicago. The Dems are a central part of the mess. The neoliberal, inauthentic opposition party's dirty little secret is that its big money, big media, big empire leadership would much rather lose to the right-wing party, even to a fascist-style Republican Party, than lose to the left, even to the mildly progressive social democratic left in its own party. I have more to say on that, but it's a lengthy topic and I go too long, so I'll save that for the Q&A. Ask me to elaborate on the Democratic Party. The third thing that I think deserves mention as a real or perhaps potential barrier to mass mobilization we need is that if we fall into the trap of excessive constitutionalist faith in impeachment, don't get me wrong, I strategically support impeachment. We all want malignant orange out of office as soon as humanly possible. Every single day that this guy sits in the Oval Office and befouls the White House with his presence is a dangerous day for the human race. But I have 6 caveats about the whole impeachment thing that we're in right now. Caveat 1. The impeachment being pursued by Nancy Pelosi and her colleagues and the corporate media, beyond Fox News that is very unlikely to be followed by removal in the Republican majority. I don't rule that out in the Republican majority Senate. I don't rule that out, but it's very unlikely. And the Senate's likely refusal to remove will be used by Trump as an electoral asset claiming exoneration next year. Caveat 2, we don't want the Christian evangelical fascist Mike Pence's apocalyptic fingers on the nuclear codes. Caveat 3, impeachment threatens to become a great rallying point for Trump's fascist, Amerikaner, I call them, base, while encouraging, if we're not careful, the nation's all too silent progressive majority to stay seated in front of their glowing telescreens to watch Pelosi, Schiff, Anderson Cooper, and Rachel Maddow claim to be magically collapsing the Trump regime from the top down, when we all know it really needs to be collapsed from the bottom up on the model of what people are doing in other countries. Caveat 4, the ruling class faction that opposes Trump, and there is a significant ruling class faction that opposes Trump, does so for imperial, militarist, and capitalist reasons that are very different from our reasons. And it is using the impeachment drama, like it used Russiagate, as a way of legitimizing American imperialism, falsely sold as national security and the national interest. Caveat 5, Pelosi and Schiff's determination, and I'm sorry if I repeat a little bit of what Jay had to say, to impeach Trump only or mainly on the narrow grounds that he tried to use the imperial leverage of the U.S. presidency to do a ruling class no-no, which was to bully Ukraine into assisting his domestic election campaign. That's the no-no. Because U.S. imperialism bullies other countries all the time, and always has, and will continue to do so. But Trump got caught with his hand in the cookie jar trying to use imperial leverage to enhance his own domestic political power. But if it's only about that, what Pelosi and Schiff are doing, this lets Trump off the hook for being an ecocidal, racist, and fascist. Kind of like, I will say as a historian, the de facto Nixon impeachment and removal, and it was a de facto impeachment and removal, let Nixon off the hook for being a racist police state henchman and a mass murderous war criminal, right? What did he actually get impeached for? For screwing up and being part of a burglary into the other major capitalist party, right? You know, this is very intra-elite what they want to impeach him on. Now, how about concentration camps? How about emoluments? How about ecocide? How about accelerating the pace of turning the planet into a greenhouse gas chamber? That is impeachable, actually. No one wants to talk about that, but it's contrary to the preamble of the U.S. Constitution, which swears all U.S. government officers to respect the general welfare and to serve the general welfare of the American and the global population. The meaningfully democratic way to remove Donald Trump is not through elite procedures. I'm sorry, I left out my 6th caveat. And that's important. We don't really have time to wait for impeachment and removal. The tangerine-tinted, tiny-fingered, Twitter tantruming tyrant Trump is a lethal sociopath with enormous means of destruction and distraction at his disposal. His dedicated base is armed, fascistic, and dangerous. We need Trump-Pence out now, not next year. And the meaningfully democratic way to remove Trump is not through elite procedures designed by 18th century slaveholders for whom democracy was the ultimate nightmare. Ask me about that as a historian, and I'll explain that comment to you. No, it's through sustained mass civil disobedience within and beyond the streets through rebellion by and for those whom the American ruling class from the days of the Founding Fathers up to the present fear and hate the most, the working class majority. And the left must not let the impeachment extravaganza, like the quadrennial electoral extravaganza, keep millions seated passively in front of television and computer screens and smartphones to be told how the nation's disastrous 1/2 party system, the ruling class corporate media, the know-it-all pseudo-liberal professional and managerial class, and the U.S. Constitution work for democracy and the common good. People, they do no such thing. Our fight, fellow workers, fellow citizens, is to build as quickly, deeply, and widely as possible a popular grassroots movement against the fascist White House and the racist, sexist, imperialist, and ecocidal system of class rule that gave rise to it. Thank you very much, and power to the people.
So, thank you so much.
Can I give you a question?
So what we're going to do right now is we've got some cards that were passed out. If you did not get a card, if you need one, please raise your hand. We're going to do a round of those. And if we could get the basket to collect those. So as you're thinking of your questions, you're writing those down.
Questions written down?
Yeah. We're gonna do that first.
Point of personal order.
We're gonna do that first. I'm sorry, this is how we're running it.
Point of personal
This
order.
isn't an open meeting. Thank you.
Of the Korean War.
Okay.
Hold on.
I appreciate that you're here.
I'm doing a point of personal order, just in keeping with.
This isn't an open meeting, sir.
I am a wounded veteran of the Korean War. I started my peace activity at the age of 80 years ago.
Okay,
I believe,
listen.
hold on. I believe I have the right to speak my question and my comments without having
So
to write it out.
what we're gonna do is we're gonna take a round from the cards because sometimes there's themes in the cards and we wanna make sure that we get the most frequently asked questions. We're also gonna offer the panelists the opportunity to ask questions of each other. And then we are gonna open the floor. But we have 2 hours here and we wanna use it most productively, okay?
Yeah, 2 hours.
Thank you. All right, so I think we heard a lot. We sort of traveled the globe and we got a little insight into a lot of different places and also some insight into the themes that we're seeing, the universal situations, the universal themes that we're seeing across the borders, right? And I would like to open things up, perhaps with a question, especially since we have an expert here on the movement in Egypt in 2011, where Mohamed Abdelfattah made the comment that this was a situation where there was no recourse for change, zero, absolutely zero. And that is a situation that's pretty different from here, where people are tantalized with the possibility of elections, of lobbying, of impeachment, of tweeting, of, I dislike that, I'm gonna raise my voice that way. All of these different forms that are offered for people to, to express themselves and to hold out hope for change. And that's also, I think, one of the, this is a common situation. It's not just unique to the United States, but it may be, we may have the worst case of that illusory possibility. So I wondered if you could speak to that to begin with, Mohamed, and maybe the other panelists as well. And so, sorry, do we have the basket going around? Again, if you have your question written down, just raise your hand and yes, we do have the basket going around. And so we'll get those, we'll get to them. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And, I've been living in the States for about 4 or 5 years now. I know things, I don't know other things, so I could definitely speak more to my Egyptian experience. And, you know, you have to understand that the temperament of the Egyptian people, by and large, is not too radical. And the fact that things led to a revolution in Egypt was really more the regime's mistake than the skillful organizing of activists on the revolution side. And in Egypt, it was just, again, there was zero recourse to change. I have a far more positive outlook on things in the States, just because by virtue of where I come from and comparing it here, there are elections that happened, there's a modicum of rule of law and checks and balances and an impeachment process. We weren't able to impeach the Muslim Brotherhood president, for example, in 2013. His militias were beating up people on the streets. So if I had the opportunity to influence things here, I would say use all channels. You know, mobilize on the streets, but also vote. Don't stay at home. Vote local, vote state, vote federal. Don't miss out on any channels. Speak up in your circle of family and friends. Because there are, you know, countless people around the world that don't have that margin of freedom to go out peacefully and to exercise their basic rights. So I think definitely that's also, I have to say that there were some mistakes on the part of some of the Egyptian revolutionaries in 2011 that were too radical and alienated a lot of groups in the Egyptian society, groups that are not as radical as the mainstream people. People who are afraid of what might transpire if we go down a very unknown path. At the same time, you had the military and the pro-Mubarak powers back then that were so skillfully directing the public opinion in a certain way, telling them, hey, look at the chaos, look at the danger, look at the riots, look at all of that, and messaging them very intensely until 2013, they had a very easy coup that they could mount. And then they took power until now. So these are my 2 cents.
Yeah, I think that there's, this is another example of what Paul referred to as American exceptionalism, that people believe that it's just been some steady course of generations of progress, and that, you know, the arc of history bends, but it bends towards justice, yada, yada, and that somehow this has been mainly through, or if not solely through elections and the Democratic Party, when in fact, I think any look beneath the surface, it has been, even the right to vote has been won for certainly Black people, Native Americans, only through the most extreme struggle. I mean, people died for that. And now it's actually being decimated. As I said, the Supreme Court just gave a green light to doing away with that, the federal courts even enforcing that. But, you know, looking deeper, and I should say the Out Now movement includes people who are working hard for Bernie Sanders, people who like Elizabeth Warren, people who think a pox on all their houses, people who dream of a Green Party that could actually get on the national map. All of that is part of Out Now, because we realize the point that Paul was making as well. We don't have time. We don't have time. These electoral systems are being not only undermined, but we have a president who openly refuses to concede that he would recognize results that went against him. So to rely on, I think there's levels of problems with that in this country, to rely on the appearance versus the reality today under a fascist regime and in general. So just
I am struck not only by how narrow the outlets are for significant real democratic voices in the electoral system and the media system, but is this okay? but also how advanced, in fact, the flat-out, hard, iron-fisted mechanisms of repression, state repression, are in the United States. I tell you, when things get serious, I remember when we marched against NATO in 2012, and someone told me on the cell phone, and I went and looked and saw him, and the Chicago Police Department had, in case they needed them, they rolled out the long-range acoustic devices, LRAs. You know what those are? Those are called sound cannons. They are very expensive devices that if the stuff gets too serious, they crank them up and they will break your eardrums. They will make the whole space that you're in uninhabitable. There's a whole bunch of so-called non-lethal crowd control technologies that are a really big deal. We have an extremely advanced and militarized police and surveillance state. We have mass incarceration numbers, the land of liberty, right, that no other country can match. Otherwise, I think we do have a lot of infrastructure for very significant totalitarian-style fascist repression. I think a number of a lot of the black community would tell you right now the different ways in which they are living under fascism right now in parts of this country. So there's that. I also think we're approaching ecologically a no recourse moment. You know, at a certain point, American exceptionalism doesn't mean a whole heck of a lot. When carbon's presence in the atmosphere is heading up to 450 parts per million and 500 parts per million, there's no recourse from the melting of the Antarctic. There's no recourse from the Amazon disappearing. Look at life even in relatively privileged parts of northern and southern California right now, where you now have to live in constant fear of devastating, climate-driven, I call them capitalogenic, not anthropogenic, because it's capitalism that's driving this climate chaos. So I don't know how much recourse we actually have anymore. We're coming to the limits of that. I think the frontier is closed. You know, I think a lot of stuff is coming home right now.
So one question I want to pose for the panel, and then I want to ask you if you have questions of each other as well, is if you can talk about the precedent for a movement like what Refuse Fascism is calling for in this country. And I think that's sort of the underlying elephant in the room, you know, are we so very different from all of these other countries? Is it just absolutely impossible to think of the population of the United States, the most powerful country, the richest country, the most bought-off country, actually taking to the streets and doing what people really ought to do and stop this regime? Is there precedent in the history of this country and things that we can point to for why this could actually happen? And I'll let whoever wants to start.
You want to start it? I'll give it.
You'll have more to say.
I think absolutely. There's probably a lot of us, most of us were out the night after Trump won. I mean, we had tens of thousands of people in the street of Chicago. People just flooding the streets, opposed, out of a lot of fear, a lot of anger, and a lot of determination. And we've often said, that's what, if you are not as angry now and acting, then you are normalizing fascism. But there was that anger. Many of us are old enough, or some of us are old enough to remember when millions of people did dedicate their lives to ending the war in Vietnam, ending for black power, for black liberation, and the joy that came out of that struggle, which seemed at the time completely impossible. When you said Vietnam will win, people looked at you like you were crazy. That was a tiny country going up against the biggest superpower of the world. And they did win. They did not win by mass protests, nonviolent protests in the street. But the fact that there was that movement at home seriously, together with black liberation, seriously undermined the U.S. military's ability to continue waging that war. So yeah, there was that experience of the 60s where everything was thrown up for question and people were moving and demanding change and experimenting with how to live in ways that had not been seen in generations, and with a real, as a book by the name Revolution was in the air. This is a different situation. We are in a different world where revolution is not in the air around the world, but there are these people's uprisings, so much to learn from and to be inspired in. But I agree with what Paul was saying. There's a whole big bright thread through the whole history of this country of rebellion against injustice and unjust authority that we need to revive and get in the streets now. We do not have, for better or worse, the reality is that we don't have the time. Now is the time that we have to move, and that will require getting over a lot of these, this mythology of America, the American exceptionalism, that America can't do bad. As Bob Avakian talks about, the great tautological fallacy. If America did it, America is great, America is good. If they did something that was horrendous, like putting Japanese Americans in concentration camps or dropping more bombs on Vietnam than on all of Europe during World War II, it was just a mistake. We have to break through that myths that keep people from seeing the reality that we're up against. And we have to do that now. But there's definitely there.
Well, I guess just to go a little deep historical, we are calling for bringing down the government, bringing down the regime. And if you listen carefully when I was talking, not just the Trump-Pence regime, but the whole system that gave rise to it. You know, if you want to go deep historical in the American experience, we did overthrow a government. We changed sovereignty between the 1760s and the 1770s and fought a war for a new government. A lot of problems with the American Revolution. I'm not necessarily a big fan of the American Revolution, because to some extent I think it was a slaveholders' rebellion to clear more space, to wipe out more indigenous inhabitants and clear more space to enslave people. But there was a change in government. I think the closest thing we've had in American history to a real revolution was the overthrow of the slaveocracy and the Civil War. And hundreds of thousands of white and then, after 1863, black soldiers enlisted in the army with the explicit revolutionary purpose of overthrowing that system. That happened. You know, on the other hand, I think some of what we're calling for is to some degree exceptional and new and distinct. I think that this moment that we're in right now is a very pivotal and critical phase of American and world history. I think the empire, the settler empire, capitalist America's capacity that it's had up until this century to displace its contradictions, its race contradictions and its class contradictions, its other contradictions, out externally into a permanently expanding frontier, a literal territorial frontier through the late 19th century, and then a global market, imperial, and warfare frontier, the whole planet in the 20th and early 21st century. Really, I think the Iraq War was a shot across the bow, has really come to an end. The frontier, in a broad, metaphorical, and literal sense, ecologically too, has come to a close. The planet is full. There's a significant new competitor state for world hegemony on the rise in China. The unipolar power of Uncle Sam is fading as time goes on, and we really are now unable to just displace both the impulses towards fascism externally and to displace the impulses towards socialism externally through imperial wars, through endless expansion. And we really are coming to a moment of Rosa Luxemburg's choice, socialism or barbarism, believe it or not. I think we're sort of at that point right now. And that's new, I think. I think that's new in American history. I think the chickens are coming home to roost and a reckoning has come.
Well, I'd like to go back to Egypt and ask a few bundled questions here related. So, because I think, I've heard this, and I think that other activists who have been involved with Refuse Fascism have heard this also when taking out this mission and this plan to people in this country. Oh, it sounds like you're talking about what happened in Egypt, and that did not end well. We don't want to see some organized theocratic force come to power, or some new, dictatorial force come to power. That's chaos. People died for nothing, and why would we want to see that happen here? We just need to stay the course, trust our institutions, and have faith in the leaders who are telling us that they've got this. So I would like to know more about how the generation that was involved in the movement in 2011 sums that experience up, and how people, themselves feel about what they participated in, how they sum that up. And then related to that, what is the way forward now in Egypt? What other forces besides the Muslim Brotherhood exist there that are, anything that people can look to? And specifically, what's the number one takeaway that we could learn from Egypt for the Out Now movement here in the U.S.?
Excellent. I hope I could. It's so hard to answer these questions. I understand people who are saying, "Oh, look at how it turned out," in a kind of a disparaging way. And I remember the sentiment started rising from even back when we were in Egypt. We were hearing it in the U.S. media from Republican circles who didn't like Mubarak to be ousted. So it was a whole oh, we don't want our guy to be ousted, but we want democracy for the Arab world. I don't care about your democracy. I have other interests that I need to protect. And we didn't care about that. At the same time, I have to say that revolutions are not easy, and they are dangerous. And for some societies, you're really opening up a lot of veins and arteries of that society. And there are a lot of emotions that could get exploited, and it could run amok in different directions, and only the organized parties in these mobilizations are the ones who are able to exploit these moments. At the same time, I don't want this argument to completely abrogate the notion of street protest. You have the right to demonstrate on the streets. You have the right for civil disobedience, for a strike, for all these. These are all rights that are enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, and in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and so on and so forth. And it needs to be used. And I agree with you. I see a sentiment in American society a lot of the time that is just wary of any kind of street mobilization in general, no matter how radical it is. And I think that's not good. But where to take it, there was a lot of romance in the Egyptian revolution. We were just letting our hearts and our emotions go in so many different directions. These were the best times of our lives. We had feelings that probably no one else had ever felt. Being able to control your own country, topple an authoritarian government that way, we're really on the moon. We felt so good, and then we felt not so good a few years later. But it wasn't because of us, it was because of really complex scheming by forces that were much more organized and much stronger than us in the region. The military, the Muslim Brotherhood, money going in different directions. So I can't give an easy answer to this one. It's complex. You need to demonstrate, but you also need to be able to reason and understand that the other side seems to be employing a lot more rational tactics that are grounded in reality, that gives them immediate wins in the here and now, while we might be screaming our lungs with a lot of ideals. Where does Egypt go from here? I don't know. I mean, they completely shut down politics right now, and I have no idea where it's headed, but I do think that it's not sustainable because people have seen what happened in 2011, and they learned the hard way that they can go to the streets and straighten things up now. But Egypt is not the United States. There are there are no institutions in Egypt, democratic institutions, that are nearly as strong or as long entrenched as in the U.S. That's my perspective on this point. If you guys want to add something.
Are those from the audience?
Okay, so this is also, I think, related to the question of how we're going to mobilize people into the streets in the U.S. is connected to the analysis of what we're up against with the regime. So this question here asks, I have been watching The Dictator's Playbook on PBS that connects common tactics of dictators such as Mussolini, Hitler, Franco, etc. These dictators at one point had popular support, but I do not see Trump as ever having popular support, but still succeeding. This feels like a new fascist dictator situation. Why? And along with that, I think this is a related question. Does anyone know if Trump's base is partly made up of white supremacists who vote against their own economic interests in order to expand American exceptionalism?
Okay, all right. Hold on a second. I want to write a thought about that. You know, there's something afoot in the Trump era that wasn't amidst Ukraine-gate that wasn't afoot during Watergate and Nixon. There's a few things afoot, and hyper-partisanization and social media and Fox News and right-wing talk radio have just walled off an entire segment of the populace, right? And is it a quarter? Is it a third? You know, Trump actually, there wasn't this huge wave of support for Trump. A quarter at most of the adult population voted for Trump. And by the way, the demographic research on it, it wasn't working class. This whole notion there was a white working class, it's not true. It's relatively affluent, not all that different than the usual Republican electorate. It's relatively affluent. This notion that there was this big populist white working class movement behind Trump is actually false. Yeah, the uniting thing by far and away amongst and between this base, two things. One, desire for an authoritarian leader. Two, racist, racial, white identity, and the two are co-joined because what the authoritarian leader is hoped that he will do is smite the arrogant, awful liberal elite who stands accused of having opened the door to let supposedly undeserving minorities get ahead of the supposedly more deserving white majority. You know, so yes, it is driven fundamentally by racial resentment. There's a lot of data and there's a lot of research on this. The main connecting link. Voting against their pocketbook interests. If the question is phrased in such a way as to imply that the base is working class, then I just want to tell you it's not. But does Trump work for majority lower middle class people? No, not at all. Look at the tax cut. I mean, even middle class people were hurt by a lot of the exemptions that they lost. Trump doesn't understand how international global capitalism and supply chains are set up, and so you've had this huge tax increase through the tariffs that are passed on to everyday consumers. But the way they just maintain their just autonomy is through this right-wing, segmented off, sectorialized media and social media universe, and that's different. And yes, it's authoritarian. It's profoundly authoritarian. There's a base of people. I mean, Trump wasn't lying when he said, "I've got a bunch of people. I could go out on Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody, and they wouldn't stand behind me." There's a cult of personality around Trump. It's really weird. It's kind of creepy. I don't think Pence. One reason I'm not that freaked out by the prospect of Pence being in the White House for 6 months is I don't know if anyone here has ever been to a Trump rally. Pence can't do that. I don't think anybody can do what Trump can do in a rally. You got to go to one of these rallies to see and to really. And they are fascist events. Trust me.
Voting against their economic interests. I agree with what Paul was saying. I think that is a, first off, that implies that their economic interests are ever on the ballot, which I think is a highly questionable proposition. There are promises of some enhancements that the Democratic Party is famous for that are, again, I would say overwhelmingly in order to maintain passivity and to distinguish themselves, and that's their role vis-a-vis the Republicans. But yeah, Trump has very, very powerful backers. This is a matter of record. What was it? Was it Bloomberg that recently reported a few weeks ago that the Wall Street backers of the Democratic Party have said that if Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders got the nomination, they would have to go with Trump. They're all, whether it's Hillary Clinton or Trump, are awash with support from the biggest money, the highest pinnacles of this society, which is not to say that there's not a real difference. There is a real difference. There's a fascist wing of the powerful that sees Trump as their last best hope to deal with all of the phenomena that everyone here has been talking about, the haves versus have-nots, the ecocide. And then there's another segment out of power and under attack themselves that sees multiculturalism and a certain democratic inclusivity as the only way to keep the lid on a society boiling with contradictions. I would just add with the white supremacy, I think that there are these underlying social transformations, including the role of women, that is also the target of this fascist regime, most especially in the Christian fascist wing of it, but also among their base. I mean, you have from Pence and his Christian evangelical fascists literally taking away a woman's right to choose what she's going to do with her life, from abortion and birth control. And I mean, there are laws on the books in Missouri right now that allow a landlord to refuse to rent to an unmarried woman with children. That's legal because it could violate the landlord's sense of propriety. This fascist movement is appalled at the transformation of women's role in society, which is still very blunted, and bound and determined to reverse that. And you have the Thugs in the Street with the Proud Boys, a male organization that is out to violently enforce, to support Trump and enforce misogyny. So I would just add that to the list of what's driving this base. But yeah, the myth that it's some rednecks from West Virginia is just that.
Well, I don't know if it's related to the question, but probably the big point here, and that it might seem obvious that we all agree on, is that Trump is an actual fascist. He may not have the exact apparatus yet, the nuts and bolts of doing what was happening in Nazi Germany or Mussolini's Italy, but as soon as he gets some margin of that apparatus, he will do it. And we've already seen glimpses of it. And trying to deport children who are receiving critical health care in a hospital in Boston. Why does he do that? A few kids or something. How does that break something that you're passionate about or your demographic cares about? He wants to show that he's capable of inflicting suffering on people that his demographic hates and has a lot of very personal, not economic, very personal resentment towards. Me as well as all friends or people back home when we were watching Trump rising, coming down the elevator at the outset of his campaign and then watching his discourse unfold up until now, the vocabulary that he uses, his lexicon, the way he thinks, it's almost as if he's translating quotes from well-known dictators in history. It seems he has like some kind of spiritual affinity with those figures. It is so shocking. Even right now, Kim Jong-un in Korea, Bashar al-Assad in Syria, El-Sisi in Egypt. Fox News was interviewing Trump when he first came to power in 2017, and he talked about Egypt. And it was obvious that he would support a dictator in Egypt, but he was like, you know what, and frankly, I like him. And I really looked closely at that quote. What do you mean you like him? You personally like a dictator? And then he was like, in another instance, and he likes the military parades of North Korea, and he actually tried to have a fully fledged military parade, and he did it. It was a modicum of it, but he is so spiritually intertwined with authoritarianism and dictatorship. When he was addressing a little mannerism, but tells us a lot, and then I could pass on the microphone. Addressing the United Nations General Assembly in 2017. His first address to the United Nations General Assembly, he says, as President of the United States, I will always put America first. I heard Egypt first when I was in Egypt too, all the time, and all of the other countries that are under the spell of dictatorships. And he's trying to break the global order right now too, and he's saying, just like you as leaders of your countries will always and should always put your countries first. He got a meager applause from the General Assembly. The other mannerism was actually at the inauguration that I want to call our attention to. When he was concluding his speech at the inauguration, he did this with his fist and cheering people on with this fist. That looked exactly like Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, a total madman who sent his country into ruins, and other dictators in history. Where do you get this body language from? Who are you watching? Who have you been watching growing up? Who's influencing your way of thinking? From a very emotional standpoint. And there are so many other examples, but I just wanted to make that clear, that it's very clear to the whole world, especially people who have lived or are living under dictatorships, that this guy is a dictator and fascist and dangerous, and he needs to be countered.
I want to follow up a little bit and really reinforce Jay's point about the Democrats to hear that the people didn't vote for the pocketbook interests because they didn't vote for Hillary Clinton is really kind of absurd, right? Obama and Clinton represent the North American Free Trade Agreement, Trans-Pacific Partnership, globalist, corporate, neoliberal, deindustrializing wing of the Democratic Party, and I think that's a really, really key point. I wanted to mention, as I was listening to Mohamed speak, that I believe this, that Trump's first wife said that he was given and kept by his bedside table a book of some of Hitler's favorite mass persuasion speeches. He studied that stuff a long time back as he was moving into being more and more vocally political in the 1980s. I saw something this morning on cable news that says the New York Times apparently has a study out, I haven't went to find it yet, or the report, that they quantified Trump's tweets, and he had just hundreds and hundreds of tweets demonizing immigrants, and I don't know, some sort of comparable number, not quite as big, praising dictators in other countries. Sometimes I feel like a Chicagoan who has also spent a lot of time living in Iowa, and sometimes you get these kind of people nodding their heads and they just can't quite get it. What do you mean? You're going crazy about Trump being a fascist and all these fascists out there. And I get this from New Yorkers too on Facebook that I'm interacting with. It's like, you guys need to get out of the city more and get into the countryside and talk to some of these people, because they are armed and they believe stuff that you just would not believe. And one thing that they really, truly, honestly believe is that whites are getting badly screwed in the United States of America, and liberal and leftist elites, pointy-headed, fancy pants PhD liberals are letting people of color undeservingly, climb in underneath them and take away, their positions in the country. You have some conversations. I've worked with people who believe this very strongly. We are still a very segregated society, extreme. The city's very segregated. The whole metropolitan area is segregated. Whites have very little, many of them, actual real-life contact with people of color. So where do they get their images of them? They get 2 images of people of color. Very, very successful entertainment, sports people, the integrated broadcast news teams, the upper middle class and the upper class, successful African Americans, and then they also get the crime reports, you know, and so they get the constant nightly decontextualized crime reports out of the west side and south side of Chicago. Any major American metropolitan area, it's the same damn thing. Same Detroit, same Cincinnati, same New York. That's their split image, utterly devoid of any real life contact with everyday, middle, working class, average African American, Latino people. And Trump plays off this. He plays off this ignorance. He's a genius at it. He's from segregated white Queens. He knows all about it. He's a Archie Bunker with silver spoon. Who we don't even know if he's really a billionaire, because we'll find out when we ever get his tax returns.
Okay, so we've got a couple other really good questions, and if there's anything else that you guys wanted to ask of each other, I do want to make sure that people know that the Out Now movement is continuing, right? We were in the streets yesterday, we are going to be out again on Saturday. Every time we do it, new people join in. We always get the applause from the onlookers, and we're all grappling with these questions that we're dealing with tonight about how we're actually going to break through. How are we going to unleash young people, students who absolutely have to be at the forefront of any one of these types of movements. But we're also very, very firm on the fact that this movement has to be non-violent, right? And this goes back to both the sorts of other examples from other countries that we're looking at, and as well as within our own history, and social research, which indicates that nonviolent movements have the most potential for involving the largest numbers of people, and we need millions of people in the streets. So this question is good to ponder, just raising, at what point in mass disobedience would you advocate violent resistance? Does anybody want to take that? Paul, maybe you want to start?
Well, there is a place for. I mean, my God, we don't want to identify our cause in any way with violence. Though I would always distinguish between violence against property and violence against people. I was part of efforts to monkey wrench the Dakota Access Pipeline as it was going through 18 counties in Iowa. I have no inhibitions about that kind of stuff. I mean, it's the long black snake that was trying to destroy and pollute the waterways of Iowa and pollute the world. There is a place for armed self-defense in some places. It's not often acknowledged, but it's true. And if you can look at some of the old photos of the early civil rights movement, in the early 1960s, and there were these guys called the Deacons of Self-Defense. I'm not sure how we got this question, so I'm accessing my historical memory here. But the Deacons of Defense and Dr. King, a true Gandhiite pacifist, knew that there was some armed self-defense for the civil rights movement in the early 1960s, necessarily to draw some limits on what the Ku Klux Klan and Nazis and other white supremacists would do. They were just going to necessarily, let Abernathy and King just be shot down in the streets in the early 60s. I mean, there's a legitimacy to that. Cornel West said that if Redneck Rebellion hadn't been standing guard during the Charlottesville events in an armed kind of way, that they just would have been descended upon and just decimated by the right-wing neo-Nazis out there. So, my God, we're not proponents of violence. We're also not going to be completely naive about the role that force often does play in history. The key moment in revolutions and rebellions is not when the masses. I mean, I know people on the left who have fantasies about taking on the American militarized police state, and I'm like, what are you thinking? What are you talking about? You don't have a shot. You know what you're talking about. But I like to try to have conversations with police officers all the time. The key moment all the time in revolutions is when at a certain point the gendarme class refuses. That's the key. That's where violence plays its key force. When you can convince the gendarme class through your example, through your persuasion, through the dignity of your cause, we are not going to shoot the people down in the streets because of what they're doing. So I don't know if that answers the question or not.
Yeah, I think as Lena said, the Out Now movement is explicitly and adamantly nonviolent. That violence is, at this point, in this situation, the tool that the Trump thugs, the MAGA fascists, are attempting to use to provoke us, to inspire fear, to and we cannot afford to be driven off our principles by that force. That doesn't mean that we are going to not defend our right to be in the streets, to be, whether it's in Millennium Park with the city of Chicago and the Park Police, or whether it's the maggots and their provocations. We're not going to be driven off message, and we're not going to, I don't consider self-defense, protecting ourselves from their attacks, to be violence. I mean, I agree with what Paul was saying. That's just a very serious thing, and only someone who's very infantile would throw around that prospect. And we don't need that. We don't need that right now. We need millions of people in the streets and acting, and that's acting in the streets, acting on our true interests, and that's what's that's what the struggle is. I was struck by a very short video from Lebanon, where I had not realized this. People know that they had, in a matter of a few weeks, thousands became tens of thousands, became hundreds of thousands, and the president has resigned. And the top cleric who's aligned with Hezbollah was part of the government, and he had his thugs, his followers, going out and beating up protesters, trying to terrorize people, really. That's what it is. It's setting examples. It seemed like they were going after women in particular. And one of the women that was interviewed in this very short video was saying, look, we are not going to be provoked. We are the many, we are the millions. We are not going to let them, we are not going to be provoked, we are not going to get into fights with them, and we are not going to let them drive us out of the streets. I thought, that is us. That is what we have to be doing, and that's what we are doing. And I just have to get back, and people might see a piece of artwork here, a portrait of a young man, Bo Lingon, who is a Iraq War veteran, who's now a revolutionary-minded activist who's with Refuse Fascism. And I think because he is a white guy, a veteran, who's gone over to the other side, he has been targeted by these, by these Trump fascists, these Proud Boys in Los Angeles. They held him down and sprayed bear repellent in his face, which can blind you. This can blind you. Tried to pummel him. And, you know, he's not backing off. He's coming out stronger than ever. And that's a response that our movement is going to take. So.
Yeah, I think I would like to add that this is such, you know, I don't want to, the very idea of even conjuring up the question of whether violence is going to be needed or used, or even without stigmatizing the individual who asked the question, you know, this is really from the playbook of authoritarian governments, because the number one thing that they want to see is this agent provocateur in a demonstration just throwing a stone or doing something, and then the entire crowd control textbook will just unleash all the bears on them. The other thing, which is even more critical, is even engaging, you know, whether positively or negatively, with the question of, like, are we violent, are we not violent? This already is alienating people from joining in. And this has happened in Egypt, is happening right now in Lebanon, in Iraq. Always happens. It always happens. And I think it's a common sense, clear no nuanced answer that there is no place for violence. This is a movement by the people who have the right to demonstrate, and no, we reject this premise to begin with. Moving on, here's what we're after. Because that, I remember they did this in Egypt, 2011, 12, and 13, and they completely won over the entire public opinion to their side, just by virtue of making people afraid.
Right. The violence is on the other side.
I want to reinforce that point about agent provocateur. I mean, any veteran leftist, going back, there's always at the meeting, there's the guy that doesn't quite fit in, he's trying to talk the language, and he's trying to sound like a socialist or some other kind of activist, and he really isn't. But he's got all this, like, we need to do this, we need to go, we need to rip this stuff and all that. That's just a time-worn authoritarian tactic, and it just goes back forever. There were news reports in Hong Kong about the Hong Kong police doing this. There are any number of stories, and it happened to Gilets Jaunes in France too. I'm sure it's happening in all the movements that we're talking about. We will have to deal with these people as long as we have movements, and it's just such a key point that's what they try and do, and thereupon to discredit you and justify the repression against your cause.
Okay. So unless there's any other questions from the panel, I'd like to see if there's any questions from the audience that haven't already been addressed that really need to be. Got Lucha and then the gentleman in the front.
Can you project?
Yeah.
I'll repeat I'll do my best to repeat as well.
Okay, well, I have a lot that I'm thinking of. There's a lot going on in my thought process off of what the panel is talking about, because I think there's a lot of very important questions that are being addressed. There's a lot of complexity to it, and I really want to appreciate what the discussion that's gone on so far. I wanted to say something about the question of Egypt and where this could go here and what people are kind of afraid of and where this could go. And I'm part of the Revolution Club, and there is an actual organized force in this country, in this society, that is getting organized for an actual emancipating revolution. There's a leader for that, Bacon. There's a new communism. There's something that's really liberating and an understanding of being able to deal with reality in a way that we can see how a whole radically different kind of world is possible. And I'm saying this not just pro forma to say it and let people know, but because actually people need to know, and it has to do with part of the equation of what can be opened up. There's the fact that I watched that movie, I haven't watched it recently, but The Square, about Tahrir Square. And the thing that I remember, I wanted to watch it again, but the thing that I remember from it that really stood out to me is you had these really earnest people who were putting all of their determination, into the fight to drive out this dictator. And what happened over and over again was people said, we just have to keep driving out the dictators. And when they put the next one in, we'll drive out the next one. And when we put the next one in, we'll drive out the next one. And it was very, it gave you a sense of a lot of determination. It also gave you a sense of, damn, they need some leadership that has a positive vision of where this could go. And there is such a party and leadership and vision that exists here in this society that I think a lot more people need to know about and get connected with, that can be part of this movement that opens up a different kind of space. And I just wanted to say, part of it's connected to me with this questions of the democratic institutions, the situation we find ourselves in, because one thing that also happened in Egypt was that there was a very popular slogan about the people and the army are one hand, right? That was something that got really popularized. Well, the people in the army were not one hand, and people learned that really the hard way, And I think it goes together with a lot of the illusions we see in this society. This has already been a dictatorship with democratic trappings, and now Trump and Pence and this whole regime, they're taking off the democratic trappings to open violent dictatorship, And I think that's important to see in all of this when we look at what can come of people getting in the streets in the way we're talking about. We can open up a different kind of space. If we don't get in the streets in this kind of way, then what's going to happen is what's happening. Who has the initiative is the fascists, the violent white supremacists, the misogynists, the Christian theocrats. That's what has the momentum right now, and it has a foundation in this country. But if we get out into the streets together in the way we're talking about, we open up the possibilities. And there isn't any guarantees of where that's gonna go. But we do have to break out of the illusion that there's some democratic institutions of this society that are gonna save us from this fascism. We have to realize that we have ourselves to bring forward in opposition to that, and in opposition to that fascist base of millions. There's millions, you know, what Paul was talking about, these white supremacists, these, you know, there's millions of these people. You know what I mean? And they're not all the hardcore of it, but there is that part of this society, and we have to open up the kind of movement where the values that are being expressed in the street by people fighting for the future are humanity first, not America first. You know, where people are fighting for the immigrants, for the women, for the LGBT people, for the people of the world, you know, where those are the things, even as we can argue and disagree about ultimately what is it going to take to get all the way past that, we got to have that kind of movement where we're opening up that kind of space in society. So mainly I just wanted to make that kind of comment because I was provoked and, you know, got my gears turning on the discussion here, and I just wanted to throw in on it.
Could you summarize your point for that veteran?
That was a lot. I was trying to think, trying to take notes mentally. Comments about the experience of Egypt not having strong, cohering leadership, and that actually being a weakness, whereas the participants saw it as a strength, and that's something for us to learn from, as well as a lot of comments about sort of the nature of the society having dictatorial nature to it even before Trump, whereas Trump is a much more naked exponent of that. I won't try to, I think those are the two main points that, but I won't try to recapitulate.
What I heard, and I really want to second, was that just changing leadership or changing the personnel at the top of the system. You know, drive this dictator, then get the next one here. You know, in this case, the United States, getting Trump out and then getting like Joe Biden, you know, what are they going to pull on that? Which is just a recycle, rinse and repeat, and then we might end up being nostalgic for, you know how we're like nostalgic about Bush? Isn't that insane right now, the second Bush, because like how bad Trump is? You know, you might have a non-venal, seriously committed, full-on, ideologically consistent fascist that'll end up making you think that things were nice when Trump was on the White House. After a Joe Biden presidency, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. near the end of his life used to say that the real issue to be faced beyond superficial matters, I think the line was a radical reconstruction of society itself. And without fundamental social systemic change, you're really just going to keep on spitting out these kind of hideous monsters at the top of the system. And then people who really are sociopathic monsters but are better at posing as the adults in the room, you know, the more responsible Council on Foreign Relations, Center for American Progress type of elites that then give way back to the Pences and the Trumps and the Matt Gateses. I say, keep your eye on Matt Gates. You know, you look at a fascist leader 10 years down the road, that guy down in Florida. You know, it's just back and forth without a revolution, without changing the society, the fundamental underpinnings of the society, not to mention the environmental issue, which I don't have time to say anymore about.
Well, and another very important point that Lucia was making, I want to, is that this kind of mass movement that right now is addressing the existential crisis facing this country, and given who Trump is, facing the world, that this is still the most powerful country in the world, that kind of a mass movement where millions of people begin to feel their power opens up the possibility for the kind of discussion we need to have, where all of these myths and all of these accepted truths and common sense are called into question. And that was the case in the 1960s and early 70s, where these revolutionary movements came from. And I'm not going to try to paraphrase what you were saying, but I would encourage everyone to acquaint themselves with the revolutionary movement, the revolutionary communist movement that Lucia was speaking to, and there's a whole table of materials there.
Talk to the thing about the army and the people.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you raised a lot of good points and reminded me of a lot of good memories too in Egypt. I don't know what you want to address, but I think one key takeaway from what you said is really critical to keep up the passion, because the other side is very passionate. They are passionate ideologues. They are passionate demagogues. They know what they're doing. They're not driven by money or power or status or career or anything. There is deeply seated hatred and ideology that they have already molded into since maybe they were teenagers or something, and now that they are in policy making, they're acting upon it. A perfect case in point, this guy Stephen Miller. He's extremely dangerous. You know, he's calculating. He knows what he's up to. He's the key intellectual advisor behind pushes for immigration policies and banning this and banning that and what to do, and I think maybe Trump sometimes is like trying to rein his craziness in or something. Not saying that Trump is as crazy, but this guy is a passionate ideologue. I remember when Michael Moore was on an interview or said something on a Facebook post, and he called it that Trump is going to win as a result of this passion. People are lining up. He called it out that Trump is going to win as a result of the passion that his voters have lining up at polling stations, and the other side with Hillary Clinton is not as passionate. When he said that reminded me of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And they were able to line up people in voting lines and get out the vote, and they have a whole theocratic ideology that has been pushing them for so many decades, and it just manifested in elections. Well, whereas the secular revolutionaries or liberal secular parties in Egypt were not able to galvanize people. They were talking about policy and intellectual things and this and that, and they were too nuanced. Whereas on the other side, you have someone who's not talking about policy at all, who's not even intelligent, and he's just cranking out soundbite after soundbite, pushing the right buttons in people's hearts, and that's it. So that's something I agree with. I don't know about how the Square documentary was truly representative of what happened in Egypt. I could talk. I don't know if we have enough time for that, but it was leaderless, and that was bad. And the sound bites that you might have heard in the documentary were not necessarily representative of actual organizing that was happening on the ground. What you said about the army and the people one hand, that was true at first, and the fact of the matter is it was the army that actually forced Mubarak to abandon his position because the popular uprising was going to break the country in general. And they forced Mohamed Morsi with the Muslim Brotherhood in 2013 again, and people realigned themselves again with the army in 2013 because the Muslim Brotherhood was trying to break that national identity, the territorial integrity of the Egyptian state and of the Egyptian society that a lot of Egyptians simply couldn't take it. So that's
Your question?
Oh, yeah. I want to compliment the panel for choosing a venerable American word, tyranny. I think every one of the founding fathers, in their criticism, George III's policies and logical reasons for the revolution used the word tyranny. I had a roommate who tried to tell me how to live and what food to eat and so forth. He was tyrannical, but he didn't have much power. So that tyranny was not awful, it was a little hard to take. So I want to raise the question of comparative tyrannies. And which is the worst tyranny? Now, what I'd like you to do is do a mental experiment in your mind. Think of all the things that you think are bad about Trump, especially the effects he has on society. And see if you can list the major negative effects that Trump has on society. Okay, now take a look at the neoliberal export of 5 million jobs to China, Vietnam, Mexico, and what have you, and look at the effects that this has on society. I won't even mention people committing suicide because their job is can't take care of their family. And so you decide which is worse, the effects of Trump. I can't stand it myself. I can't stand to look at it. But my personal repugnance should not prejudice my list of all of his evils, and he has some evils. And I don't find Biden particularly charming, but Biden is part of the neoliberal Democratic conspiracy to export jobs, and they've exported 5 million of them. So think about the consequences for society of Trump's evils versus Biden's evils. And I think that if you look at it objectively and honestly, you'll see that if Biden's elected, we need to impeach him even more strongly than we need to impeach Trump. Do you agree? See, I ended up with a question.
Okay, yeah, no, suggestion from the panel is there anybody in the audience who wants to take that question? Nico. Can you project, Nico?
Well, I think the panel has been presenting an extremely anti-Trump viewpoint. I think you have a responsibility to deal with the challenge of my question.
Sure. But
You missed most of the panel. You came in after we had presented.
Where I'm wrong.
So that
Okay.
kind of
we're going to need to wrap up too, so this is an opportunity to have other voices in the mix. I think,
I'm raising
look,
a very basic issue and you're avoiding it. I'm raising the issue that has...
it's not a
Look at the
terrible
end.
question.
I'll take it.
Hey, it's not a terrible question.
Look at
Listen, it's not a terrible
And
question.
you're trying to completely avoid it.
Look at the export of jobs has been going on for 50 years. It is a function of the globalization of manufacturing that is happening everywhere, every developed country in the world. It's
The jobs that others are
Do
exporting.
you want to listen, or you want to just have?
Well,
We'll have a program for you next week, okay? That's not a factor of.
Biden is responsible for the neoliberal job export.
We are not in favor of any politician running. Out Now movement incorporates people who support any number of politicians, who support no politicians, who are involved, who are not involved, who oppose, who support the whole electoral process. It has nothing to do with who is going to be elected. It has to do.
You don't think you're successful?
You
don't think you're successful to help Biden?
We are not about helping any politician. We are about stopping fascism. That is what we're about, and we take responsibility to meet the greatest challenge facing people in this country in decades, an existential challenge, where Trump and his whole movement, his fascist movement, are destroying the very means by which we might be able to solve any of these existential problems, including climate change, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So no, we're not gonna go there.
2,000 votes
No.
as a Green Party candidate in 2008 advocating
Please
the
stop.
Green New Deal. I was the first one to advocate the Green New Deal.
We're wrapping it up, yeah.
By focusing on Trump, you're doing the corporation's bidding by focusing on how bad
That's
Trump
fine.
is,
We
and
understand
you're
your
not
perspective.
dealing
We've heard
with,
that before.
global warming.
We understand
And what the
that.
corporations are
So,
doing.
and I think one of the interesting things that, has been a theme in a conversation that we've had today all through each presentation is that what we're looking at doing, what we are looking at accomplishing, cannot be looked at as some kind of piecemeal or simplistic solution. Anything that actually, a movement that can actually drive out this regime that is so opposed to fundamental human rights can only be ousted through major upheaval and questioning of some basic ways of functioning of this system that people have taken for granted for decades. And people are troubled by. But I think that Paul Street's citing of the extensive research, which has been suppressed by the mainstream media, that the base of support of Trump's supporters is not people who are mainly economically disadvantaged by this system. It is people who are, generally speaking, well off, people who have some property, who have some income, but are deeply resentful of people of color, of the role of women in the society, and all of the different sort of social outcomes of our changing world. And it is a changing world. The whole world is riven by a struggle between the haves and the have-nots, and it is driving all of these different movements from Chile to Lebanon, you name it, right? This is the situation, and that's not different from here either. And I do think that it's absolutely mind-boggling that anybody can look at Trump, who literally has a golden toilet, and say that this man represents anyone's economic interest. Yes, we appreciate that. We appreciate that, and we're gonna wrap up here. Yeah, I want to go to the back of the room real quick. Can you project, Sammy?
I just want to say that I lost my job when I was 65 years old and intended to work until I was 72. I lost my job because my company sent it to India. Okay, now, I mean, it was part of their company, but it still went to India, and I had to retire, and that was my working career because I was 65. And I'll tell you this, if I had a job, I would give it to anyone. I would give my shirt off my back right now if I could get rid of Trump, if I could get rid of someone who would take children out of their mother's arms and separate them and put them in a cage where they know nothing, where know nobody, don't have the language. All of these things are Trump. All of these things are Trump. He's a fascist, he's a Hitler, whatever you want to call him, and I would give anything to stop him. And if it means standing in front of neo-fascists and getting my head bashed in, I'm going to do that too. I will give anything to stop that man and his whole regime, and Stephen Miller, thank you for bringing him up, that are making me just cry every day. And that's what I have to say to that. I don't care who else is running. Frankly, I don't like any of them. But that's besides the point. Anything, except maybe Pence, is better than Trump. We have to get rid of the fascists, and then let's worry about what happens next. We'll be able to deal with them better because we're stronger for getting rid of Trump. But I can't just sit here and have an intellectual discussion on who's better, Biden or what's her name, Wanger, whatever her name is, the economist. Please, let's talk about what's really important. Getting rid of Trump and Trump out now. Woo!
I am an atheist, but amen to that. I don't believe in God, so I don't usually say amen, but yes. Okay, so we are going to wrap this up. I want to recommend to people who want to actually dig into the whole question of the fascist ideology that underpins Trump's program, the book How Fascism Works by Jason Stanley. We brought him to town last spring, and he spoke in depth about how Trump's rhetoric is not just symbolically dictatorial, but how his rhetoric is actually rooted in 10 points of a fascist program. And it is precisely designed to pit people against each other, to confuse people, and to institute a new order on society that is completely opposed and completely different from the kind of society that we need to have, where people are respected. And so I really want to invite everyone to stop by the table before you leave today and pick up some flyers. Let's get the word out. We are taking to the streets again next Saturday. Rain, shine, snow, sleet. This is Chicago. We don't know what kind of weather we're going to get, but we are going to be out there every Saturday demanding that the Trump-Pence regime must go now. And I invite everyone to participate. We have t-shirts, we have lawn signs, we have materials that you can spread around and help make this happen. because it needs to happen, and it's on each one of us to do that. And if anybody wants to continue talking, we do have to clear the room, but some of us are going to get together afterwards, so I invite people to stick around and let's talk further. Thank you for coming. And thank you again to our panelists. Again, Paul Street, Jay Becker, Mohamed Abdelfattah, thank you again so much.